I love ambiguity more than most people. I first of all want to redress any mistaken belief that principles of equality and non-discrimination are the enemies of religious freedom. It's worth reflecting for a moment that until the achievements of the UN system in guaranteeing equality, the human rights systems which existed over centuries created different classes of rights holder and defined rights or lack of them according to that sort of classification. The Universal Declaration in 1948 was decisive in breaking that pattern of different rights by differential status, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, was extraordinary in achieving binding commitments in Article 2 to everyone without distinction, or guarantees to everyone without distinction of any kind. Contracting states are meant to bring all human rights home to everyone, no matter who they may be, on the same terms. There's a similar, separate, slightly different, autonomous equality right found in Article 26, which requires equal protection of the law, no matter what its subject matter. And without getting bogged down in the differences between the two, the important thing is that discrimination under both Articles 2 and 26 have this feature in common, and it was particularly well described by the Italian delegate Francesco Capitorti during the drafting of the ICCPR as unfavourable and odious distinctions which lack any objective or reasonable basis. The standard test under the ICCPR is whether the differentiation at issue is based on reasonable and objective criteria. If it is, it doesn't amount to discrimination for the purposes of Articles 2 or 26. It is staggering to think that for so long there have been, and to an extent still are, gaps in Australia's discrimination laws, so that in some jurisdictions religion is not a prohibited ground of discrimination. A couple of things account for this. One is that no one really asked for it, partly out of mistrust that it might be used as a form of weaponry in private litigation between religious or ideological opponents, particularly after the Catch the Fire litigation. Also, there has been a false perception that freedom of religion and protection against discrimination on other grounds exist in some sort of barometric relationship where one increases at the expense of the other. So I think shattering that myth is crucial to a better conception of inclusiveness. So the first point I want to make today is that protection against religious discrimination needs to be recovered in combination with protection for religious freedom to ICCPR standards, and both should be regarded as dignity-based protection like all other rights. The second point is related and answers the question whether all human rights are equal. It has become a common feature in contemporary political debate to criticise those seeking greater protection than currently exists for freedom of religion, that they're illegitimately asserting supremacy for it over other rights. And what we also see avert against them, quite commonly in fact, is the proper and long-established principle of international law that there's no hierarchy of rights, that all human rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent and interrelated, so freedom of religion can't trump other rights. Yet, no one, to my knowledge, is sensibly asking that freedom of religion should trump other rights. And so the idea that this is occurring when merely seeking Article 18 standards is also perhaps Pasquinian. The principle of indivisibility, in fact, stems from a number of sources, but most recently the Vienna Declaration and Programme of Action after the disintegration of the former Soviet Union, with the aim of emphasising that the international community must treat human rights globally in a fair and equal manner, on the same footing and with the same emphasis. This, as I understand it, is exactly what those who advocate freedom of religion want: recognition for freedom of religion shoulder to shoulder with all other rights in the ICCPR. So the second point I want to make is that the maxim that all human rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated is something that promoters of freedom of religion stand by, in the sense in which it is and always was meant, and are not seeking to trump other rights or in contradiction of it. So, how is it that the accusations stick somehow in public minds that protection for religious freedom will do this, in particular by violating principles of equality, as some have maintained? The answer, as we know, lies partly in the way anti-discrimination is drafted in Australia to render unlawful discrimination on prohibited grounds, but for the exceptions. In Australia, we're habituated to the mistaken belief that all forms of distinction should carry the stigma of prohibited discrimination, and so any exception is perceived as concessionary to authorise what Capitality described as odious. The public inevitably then asks, why is it that religious schools and other bodies should be given what seems to be a right or a privilege to discriminate? And when exemptions for religious schools and other bodies are found at Commonwealth level in the Sex Discrimination Act, which protects against gender and sexuality-based discrimination, it only cements a thoroughly negative impression that it's the purpose and pleasure of religious entities to discriminate on grounds of sexuality, above all things, and that those which do so are little more than institutions established for the furtherance of advanced forms of religious bigotry. So it's necessary to clarify that the basis on which religious schools intend to operate is freedom of religion, which supplies the reasonable and objective criterion for distinction in its positive, collective, institutional dimension, not some skewed, negative and pointed form of gender and sexuality-based discrimination, in spite of the regrettable impression which the Sex Discrimination Act exemptions create. And what schools seek is simply the ethos-based protection which is well recognised in international law, particularly in the work of the Special Rapporteur on religional belief, in the jurisprudence of the European Court on Human Rights, and in the long established terms of the European Workplace Directive on Discrimination. In my view, any such exception doesn't belong in the Sex Discrimination Act and should be expressed more generally and positively. The approach taken in the European Convention institutional ethos cases, when examining whether any support for ethos has gone too far in impinging on an employee's right, is to balance the individual's rights, and it's usually their private or family life or freedom of religion on one hand, and the right of the religious organisation to autonomy on the other. Since the state is called upon to guarantee these rights, its job is to choose adequate means to make any interference proportionate to the end pursued. So that's the European approach. A simple way of summarising those European decisions is to say there's strong support for loyalty to ethos in those findings, except where the matter is seriously mishandled procedurally. Nick and Aroni and I have an article on this which will be published very soon, so I'll move on. At the recent Freedom for Faith conference, Justice Derrington unhelpfully commented on the protection for religious ethos by saying that there is no justification in law for guaranteeing that one right, let alone an institutional right, will trump any other rights. There's a great deal that's perplexing in this, which I don't have time to cover. It certainly perpetuates the mythology of trumping. The Human Rights Committee's approach under the ICCPR is this: if, in response to a discrimination claim, organisational ethos provided the appropriate, reasonable and objective criterion for differentiation, it's quite possible that the question of limitation of freedom of religion may not even be enlivened. It may not even be necessary to consider Article 18.3, and I find that interesting. On the subject of Article 18.3, which provides the scope of permissible limitation, when opposing freedom of religion in public debate, it's often said that Article 18 is susceptible to broad restriction, even if this were true, which it isn't, and of course some aspects can't be restricted at all. It provides no basis at all for failing to give freedom of religion the protection it needs in Australian domestic law, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. More importantly, I would instead stand by the very terms of limitation for the guarantees we need. Article 18 doesn't give with one hand when defining the scope of religious freedom and then take it away with the other in the terms of limitation. The essence of freedom of religion lies in the protection which the terms of limitation themselves accord. Article 18.3 operates as a guarantee that the freedom will not be encroached upon in breach of its terms where it's not necessary to do so, measured against very strict standards. So, whenever we're reminded that freedom of religion isn't absolute because it's subject to limitation terms, the answer is that those very terms are meant to be secured in Australian domestic law, and without them, freedom of religion is not given effect according to Australia's ICCPR promises. My third point, therefore, is that the scope of rights and limitation are equally important in guaranteeing protection, and in order to be effectually incorporated into domestic law, must subsist substantively in the law by some means. They aren't, and charters, I would suggest, will do nothing to improve the position but only worsen it, because they prescribe the ICCPR rights in a menu listing without the terms of limitation which bestow on them the essential character as guarantees. Charters simply list all ICCPR rights, if they list them in full at all, and then give the wrong interpretation by declaring that they may be restricted impermissibly. This brings me to the difference between implementation and violation. I remember one of the Ruddock panellists, not Nicaroni, I hasten to add, commenting when the panel met here in February last year, that we're not seeing evidence that freedom of religion is being encroached on. We're just not seeing that in our consultations. The point I want to make here, fourthly, is that there's a world of difference between, on the one hand, situations of obvious and persistent violation, which that panel member thought they needed to see before they could be persuaded to reform domestic law to Article 18 standards, and on the other, Australia's obligations of implementation, which have been fundamentally unaddressed since Australia's ratification in 1980. It's not a principled approach to reform to say there is no surfeit of examples of hideous violation when obligations of implementation are foundational to bringing rights home domestically and on a non-discriminatory basis. Finally, I would note that the ICCPR as a whole is based on the recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. It provides an integrated scheme of protection for fundamental rights, enjoyed in parallel with each other, in an interface which gives explicit recognition to the coexistence of other rights in terms of limitation by definitional thresholds and interpretive provisions, among other things. It's decidedly focused on the individual, all individuals, not only to guard them against threats to their personal liberty and personal security, but also in support of personal and collective autonomy without undue interference. In practice, these are enjoyed in variety and plurality by everyone, or should be. The ICCPR recognises in its preamble that the individual has duties to fellow individuals and the wider community to strive for the promotion and observance of all ICCPR rights, and this seems an appropriate moment to press the refresh button on that. I commend the ICCPR for all its imperfections as an inclusive universal model because, and I'll end on this, there's been a disquieting tendency in recent times to misconceive human rights protection, or to claim that others are misconceiving human rights protection when asserting it for themselves, to mean that my human rights can disentitle others of theirs, that others should sacrifice their human rights in the service of mine, and the intended universally of all human rights for all people everywhere would then simply be reduced to a form of universality that demands all human rights at all times for me. Thank you.